Disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation.
The history of the future.
All right, everyone. It is Wednesday, which means it is another episode of Disruptive Innovation FM. I'm your host, Jeffrey Colon. We are doing a multimedia segment this week. And what I mean by that is we are recording both on Spreaker and I'm videoing this from the YouTube channel, just so if people want to watch on YouTube, they can do that as well. So, a lot to talk about this week. This past week's episode, or I should say last week's episode, was all about the Super Bowl and how the advertising model has been slowly eroding in some respects, if you look at it that way. The agency model undergoing a lot of strain at the moment. But we wanted to definitely talk about, basically just an article that I read this past week in the New York Times. There are now 40 to 100 startups valued at $1 billion or more in the world. The majority of them are located, obviously, in Silicon Valley, others in some hotbeds of tech, Tel Aviv, New York, Seattle, Los Angeles, Boston. But I think anywhere that a company has a good idea, based on the fact that the web sort of unites our commonalities, if you have a good idea and it's something that can bring something better to the market, it's going to obviously, it can be started anywhere. You could be in Omaha, Nebraska, or Detroit, Pittsburgh, for that matter. I think actually a lot of Midwestern cities are going to have some interesting startup revolution, especially in those cities around a lot of brain capital, so to speak. But the interesting part about the article that was in Tuesday's business section of the New York Times, the founder and CEO of Evernote, which is a great sort of disruptive model to the publishing model as we know it, or the traditional publishing model, is that no business is safe anymore. So business models are pretty much in constant jeopardy. So I think some of the stress that maybe some people feel out there in the world of business, I think a lot of that is over the fact of there's just a constant unknown. What is going to happen in terms of business? So, again, we've talked a lot about the different types of parts of history that have existed with the disruptive model. In our first week, or our first episode, we discussed the music industry model, and touched a little bit also on, in our second episode, about the broadcast model, radio, the fact that Podcasts such as this, YouTube, other formats are sort of disrupting the radio model. And then, of course, we discussed how Napster disrupted physical CDs or physical media, that then iTunes disrupted Napster, and now Spotify and Pandora and a lot of streaming services are disrupting iTunes. So there is really this evolution that happens in all industries. Netflix disrupted Blockbuster. Hulu disrupts Netflix. Some people think Amazon might be the disruptor of Netflix, and mainly because of the cloud. Netflix actually uses Amazon for the cloud, and Amazon actually wants to get into offering streaming services for many devices, an area that ultimately Netflix wants to get into. And there's sort of like a conflict of interest there, so it should be interesting to see what happens. But we don't know the end of that story yet. I mean, again, this is sort of the evolution of business. That's yet to be written. And we, the only thing that we really learned from that, there's one item that's clear from all of this. And that's basically that right now, in the climate of the business world, there is one law. Some people might say it's the Wild West. I like to sort of look at it like it's the law of the jungle, which is that you follow this one piece of advice, and that is you disrupt or be disrupted. And I think a lot of companies are now starting to realize this. They're seeing the writing on the wall, no matter what industry they might be in. Because you have to think about this. Every business model must eventually come to an end. That's just sort of how we've seen business evolve over the last 100 years. There's nothing that's sort of left over from the industrial era, at least in the original sense, because all of business evolves just like all breathing entities, all living entities in some respects. And we have to learn, just by the rule of law and science, that matter cannot be created nor destroyed. So the trick amongst those in business, I think, is to recognize your own impending demise. When do you start to sort of see the writing on the wall that you're irrelevant? And instead of trying to hang on to an archaic system in some respects, you sort of push for the disruption and pretty much try to cause your collapse in some respects. Easier said than done, if you think about it. Some companies plan it. They look at evolution, they have innovation labs, they put money into research and development. Other companies, I think they are slow into sort of seeing the writing on the wall. They don't plan on it. They try to play the defensive measure. Or they welcome it, but it's almost too late, and they've missed out on the white space of whatever the new impending technology may be that is replacing theirs. So business leaders, I think now, in most of these organizations that are still hierarchical in their setup, which doesn't really fit the new business world if you think about it. Hierarchies are for the military. You need it for warfare. Doesn't work so much now with the way that the web has interconnected all of us, especially the social web. in terms of how we all do business. We're almost better off moving toward a model that is a lot like a tribal system. You sort of have maybe possibly a inner circle, but it's surrounded by others who can basically know what's going on in the organization at all times. And they can move quickly. If that inner circle says we really need to do this, everyone is there sort of on a level playing field to figure out how do we carry this out to the best of our ability as a group. It's what I like to call the hive mind. But leaders, I think, in this day and age in business, they really have to recognize when a competitive weapon can be a weakness to their organization and develop peripheral vision. This is when they really have to use their side view mirrors. So think about you're driving a car, you have your rear view mirror, you can see what's coming up behind you. You could sort of protect yourself, but there are some things that you may not see until they're almost upon you. And I think that's where peripheral vision really comes in handy in the world of business now. And besides using, or I should say in addition to using this peripheral vision, I think a lot of leaders and business organizations now really have to overcome the variety of corporate diseases that sort of infect the body politic, and that is myopia and inertia, which ultimately are going to lead to certain death. And a lot of this obviously is ingrained in culture because you have these systems that companies build up. You have that period of mystery. You solve that mystery. You move through the mysterious phase into the algorithmic phase. How do we replicate this millions and millions of times to greater success? And that's ultimately what leads to most death, if you think about it from a business perspective. Again, not to be cryptic here, but using this as an analogy. If you don't, as you move through that cycle of, or that funnel of exploration that businesses move toward, as they get to that stage where they mass scale and they replicate, they actually have to sort of send some people back up to the top of the funnel where the mystery is to sort of solve what the new mysteries are in the world of business. So when people bring up things like best practices, what works here so I can replicate it 1,000,000 times over? There's nothing wrong with wanting to know best practices in a specific industry. The issue at hand, I think, now is that best practices are hard to replicate because the world at large is moving and constantly changing the dynamic. So last week, I said we'd talk a little bit about Facebook in some respects, and this is where I think they come into the conversation. I remember Facebook, like many people who might be listening to this, back in 2004 when it launched. I had a .edu address from my old alma mater of Lehigh University that I still used every once in a while. And I used that to get on Facebook early. It wasn't around 2004. It was probably closer to 2006. But I still needed a .edu at that time. And then in 2007, I didn't use it too much, explored with it. It was all college students, so it wasn't as exciting to me as Friendster or MySpace were at the time, or LinkedIn for that matter. But the interesting thing is, around 2007, one of my interns who was with the company I was at the time had informed me, hey, look what they're doing. They're actually going to roll out groups and community pages and brand pages. You got to check this out. This is wonderful. This might be a whole new way for brands to communicate with audiences. And obviously, we established a lot of those early communities and brands on Facebook. And of course, over time, companies would say, hey, what are the best practices? And you would put those, or you would initiate those best practices and put them into good use. The interesting thing is those best practices probably may have worked in that early period, that mysterious period. For almost 2 or 3 years, you could initiate the same best practices. So somewhere between 2007 and 2010. Fast forward now to 2013. When someone asks what are the best practices that you can utilize on Facebook, the rules are totally rewritten. They're very different from what they were 3 years ago, or 6 years ago for that matter. And the reason being is because Facebook has evolved from more than a simple earned ecosystem into one that really is more paid. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to institute new best practices that maybe didn't exist at that time. And if you institute those best practices, in 3 months, they're going to be different than they are now, and in possibly 2 months after that, a month after that. Every week, there may be new changes. As we know, every Tuesday, Facebook sort of rolls out new changes on the platform. So there's always new things that one has to be used to in terms of how to replicate, or duplicate, I should say, best practices. But the one thing about instituting best practices, and again, there's nothing wrong with organizations wanting to do that. Again, they probably want to make the most out of their investment in these social programs, these social marketing programs. But best practices are not innovative. None of them are innovative. They're tried and true. It's what you do when you sort of say, hey, I want to get results that are going to possibly lead to this. But you're never going to really move beyond the larger crowd that you may be swimming with. So these are all things I think companies have to think about. Do they want to be in the business of reproducing the algorithm, things that are tried and true that they can replicate on scale, best practices, so to speak? Or do they want to be a little bit on the bleeding edge and institute next practices, things that might be a little more innovative? Or do they really want to go beyond all of that and pretty much disrupt themselves every couple of years to the point where there's no way to really institute best practices because they're constantly evolving and reinventing themselves? So those are the things I think companies really have to think about now that it's 2013 and business as usual is really not about certainty, but about the fact that no business really is safe. So a couple of things just to think about in terms of those really trying to reorganize their company, or for those who might be in the situation of launching a company, going the startup route, being entrepreneurial. Because I think, when I started this show and when I wanted to talk about innovation and specifically things that dealt in a disruptive manner, I think I'm speaking to two audiences here. Those who are maybe at established businesses that are trying to figure out how do we evolve and innovate and become interesting, go beyond sort of what we've done for a very long period of time. and those who are really trying to think like a startup and launch a startup and fill a new need that might be disrupting a business model, or maybe filling a whole new white space that hasn't been catered to. But in terms of, some of these tips or bullet points to think about, things to just sort of take away while you think about how this applies to your particular industry, business, field, etc. Think about borrowing from other industries. So we now live in a world where if you work in publishing, you can't just think about how do we operate in publishing. You should be asking yourselves, how would a tech company operate? How would a music company operate? How would a retail company operate? Some people might think, wait a minute, that's not going to be applicable to my business. That's the whole point. There are good learnings that you can take away from all industries and apply it to your business. That's really the essence of thinking like a startup. That really is the essence of thinking in a disruptive manner. You want to use analytics for taking the pulse. You shouldn't be just sitting in a room of people who sort of say, well, I think this is happening because this is what the people around me are doing. That's important. That's good sort of creative thinking, right brain thinking. But we want to also be able to use the data that exists out there to sort of figure out what might be happening. Also, how do you implement an entrepreneurial spirit and culture within your organization? Even if you've done things the same way for the past 50 years, you're not safe. The only thing that might protect you is innovation. And the only way you're going to really adopt innovation is to spread sort of this entrepreneurial spirit and culture within your organization, whether you're one person or a million people in your company. Also, what's your omni-channel approach? So, we always sort of sit around and think about what are we going to do in this, what are we going to do here in the digital space? What are we going to do in the physical space? What are we going to do? And you can't think in those terms. What are you going to do in the world at large so that the user feels like they have a good experience with you and your brand, whatever it may be that you're trying to sell or market or promote? Think omni-channel. Think 360. I don't think that's really any new advice to most of you who are out there who are trying to figure out ways of implementing new systems. And then also think about this for a second too. If you have sort of a front line with your business, whether it's suppliers or distributors, sales personnel, you have to remember they're not going to tell you about the nuances in the marketplace. They're not going to come and say, oh, hey, this is happening. People are starting to do a little bit more on this and this. By the time they tell you that, it's probably a little too late. So you really have to have the ability to sense and respond, or your company is doomed to fail. You have to almost know when to pivot before you pivot, based on sort of what's happening in the marketplace. Because if you don't take the pivot at the right time or think that, oh, we can catch up, we can speed up our transition, it may be too late. And I always sort of say to people, where's the best place that you can stay up on this data? How do you listen without really being on the front lines anymore to figure out what the nuances are in business? And my answer to that is social listening and sentiment. See, this is why social media is important. Not because of all the ridiculous gurus that are out there, all these people who are snake oil salespeople. It's because it actually allows you to sort of see what the sentiment is and what consumers are doing in terms of how they interact with your business, how they interact with your products, how they interact with competitive products. If for anything, if you don't feel that your company needs to have a social presence of some type, at least adopt a social listening angle. It'll give you information to figure out what those competitive attacks might be, what different disruptive systems are happening out there, what technology is actually on the up. So that's one of the things I think a lot of companies, when they sort of say, we don't really have a social policy, that's understandable if you don't know how to activate all of your employees maybe on these sort of public-facing platforms. But if anything, you should have sort of a command center, even if it's one dedicated person within your organization. And in the case of those who might be sole proprietors or startups, shared across a variety of people, the ability to just listen to see what's going on out there and figure out how to sort of guide your business into that space that others might not really be capitalizing on. I think that's the tried and true sort of lessons in terms of how business leaders, again, should be really approaching social. Not looking at it in terms of, how do we activate people on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or Pinterest or any one of these numbers of multiple platforms that are out there. But, hey, what are people saying about us? What are people saying about the business and industry we're in? What are the new innovations that we should pay attention to? What are some innovations that we should maybe consider ourselves because we don't see anybody talking about that? That's a really great lesson that I don't see enough companies necessarily utilizing in this day and age. So those are some things to think about. Next week, I think we will talk a little bit more again about some of the things that were discussed at Davos, some of the disruptive innovation that was discussed in terms of the 4 fine points. And there's a wonderful article, a fantastic article that was, I think, in the Financial Times out of London, that talked about the 4 areas of why companies need to actually put money into research and development. And I'll make sure that I post that for everyone, we talk a little bit more about that next week. I forgot to mention feedback at DJGEOFFE on Twitter. Disruptive Innovation FM.
The history of the future. Disruptive Innovation FM.